This is India Insight with Sunny Sharma. Today is my part three discussion on Let Nobody Turn Us Around, an African American anthology. Today is the part three discussion. Today we'll be discussing section three, From Plantation to Ghetto, The Great Migration, Harlem Renaissance, and World War. So, as I previewed before in the last podcast, the Harlem Renaissance was a bursting of intellectual and creative artistry in music, and intellectual thought and criticism of white oppression. There are many prominent poets during this era, such as Jean Toomer, Claude McKay, Nella Larson, these were all poets and novelists, and Countee Cullen, who was a poet, novelist, and playwright. There are giants of this era, such as Zora Neale Hurston, who is a writer, anthropologist, and filmmaker. And of course, as I said before in the last podcast, the Shakespeare of Harlem, Langston Hughes, who is credited with the innovation of jazz poetry, was an American poet, social activist, novelist, playwright, and columnist. Also, what was spanning this period of the Harlem Renaissance was World War I from 1914 to 1918 and World War II, where millions of blacks were enlisted, as well as many other American citizens. Yet there was still rampant discrimination in the military. So, what also was characteristic of this period was the Great Migration, where many rural agricultural southern blacks moved to the urban north. The era of Jim Crow not began, but was in its height. The era of McCarthyism, where the blacklisting of many communists, especially many black socialists, happened. Many blacks strayed towards communism as they saw the limitations of capitalist exploitation, seeing that class exploitation was related to race exploitation. There were many communist activists of this period, such as Cyril V. Briggs, who was also a prominent Pan-Africanist. Probably one of the most important community organizers of the 20th century, Marcus Garvey, as well as his wife, who wrote a book about her husband, who carried on his legacy. She was a journalist and activist in his organization. There's also Alice Moore Dunbar Nelson, who is a poet, journalist, and political activist. There's a preeminent economist who was a socialist, socialist while at Columbia University, but when he transferred to University of Chicago, he became more conservative. Abraham L. Harris, very prominent economist. There are many other communist organizers: Angelo Herndon, Abraham L. Harris, as I said before. Mary McLeod Bethune, who's an educator and philanthropist, Adam Clayton Powell, who's a pastor, Baptist, and a Harlem representative, labor organizer, Esther Philip Randolph, first editor of the Harvard Law Review, Charles Hamilton Houston, who really, I guess, in some way is a part of the legacy of Obama, because Obama was the first president of the Harvard Law Review. Claudia Jones, who's also a community organizer. One of the most famous African-American figures of this period, who was Paul Robinson, who was an actor and socialist, a very well-traveled man. As we'll see in the podcast, I'll describe him more in the podcast. Thurgood Marshall, who was one of the most prominent legal minds in American history, who was a part of the Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas case, which ruled that separating children in public schools on the basis of race was unconstitutional, overturning the Plessy v. Ferguson decision of 1896 that previously established separate but equal. So before I get started, if you enjoy this video podcast, please follow, share, and subscribe for future episodes. And my podcast is called India Insight with Sunny Sharma, and my YouTube channel is Sunny Sharma at India Insight Movement. This 6-part series in honor of Black History Month in February on Black intellectual thought, beginning with an introduction and afterwards spans 5 periods, covering 5 different eras of American history since the founding of the American Republic around 1776. This series begins with the period of slavery and abolitionism, 1768 to 1861, and ends with contemporary Black thought, 1975 to the present, which concludes with the seminal election of Barack Obama to the presidency in 2008. These sections are based off the book Let Nobody Turn Us Around, an African American anthology. Now to get started. The 4 decades represented by Section 3, 1915 to 1954, were an era of tremendous change for the African American community. Like the South African apartheid system, America was not just a racist state in which constitutional safeguards and civil liberties, such as access to voting rights, political representation, and economic and social development, were limited by governmental authority. Blacks were also victims of revived Ku Klux Klan domestic terrorism. This is best evidenced by racial films like Birth of a Nation that distorted the political achievements of Reconstruction and exploded enrolled membership in the KKK nationally. The height of white supremacy came after World War I, as best evidenced by the Red Summer of 1919, a period characterized by the murder of hundreds of African Americans, which left thousands of black people homeless due to attacks from racist mobs. This rise in factionalism and mob violence was something that figures such as President Lincoln and the founding fathers warned America of. By the 1920s, this was a definite reality. As Dr. Marable and Dr. Mullings relate, Black Americans were increasingly subjected to de facto segregation in many northern cities, and white-owned banks frequently denied credit and capital to African Americans starting businesses or buying homes in predominantly white areas. This repression, along with the Great Migration, whereby millions of African Americans moved from the rural agricultural South to the urban industrial North, transformed approaches to education, agitation through protests, and political organization. The migration of millions of Black people to the North resulted in the formation of new urban communities with elaborate social infrastructures. Black newspapers, churches, schools, funeral establishments, beauty and barbershops, fraternal organizations, theater groups, and similar institutions. By 1930, Harlem had become the largest urban center in North America and was virtually the mecca of Black culture and the arts. The flowering of the Harlem Renaissance, a literary and cultural expression of the social forces that produced the Great Migration and the modern ghetto in the 1920s, did not boast just a new generation of artists and intellectuals born in the age of jazz, such as Jean Toomer, Claude McKay, Nella Larson, Zora Neale Hurston, Countee Cullen, and Langston Hughes. It also involved an essential social critique. As the author so astutely recognized, the phrase New Negro was used to characterize the new levels of militancy, racial consciousness, and cultural energy that were most visibly represented in Harlem. Harlem not only became the intellectual, cultural, and financial center for African Americans in America, it also produced radical new perspectives and approaches of self-actualization, protests, and established the foundations for the development of a new Black bourgeoisie. As highlighted by the authors, these complex factors, the Great Migration to the North, the explosive growth of Black urban communities, the development of a Black working class, all within the constraint of racial segregation, created the space for new protest ideologies and formations. The death of the most prominent African American leader of the 20th century, Booker T. Washington, saw an end to his racial accommodation policy as well as the beginning of some unexpected outcomes with the arrival of Marcus Garvey on the scene in America. The Jamaican-born Marcus Garvey was not only the main advocate for Black nationalism and racial separation, which ran counter to the desire of Frederick Douglass and the NAACP, who both sought a pluralistic, integrated America. He was outspoken in his criticism of both the NAACP and challenged W.E.B. Du Bois' leadership. As the founder of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, UNIA, in 1914 and arriving in America in 1916, Garvey quickly amassed a large following of Black, poor, and working class people who were enamored and swayed by his charismatic oratory abilities and organizing skills. In the UNIA's Declaration of Rights of the Negro People of the World, ratified in August 1920 in Harlem, Garvey takes inspiration from more radical early ideas of Delaney and Blyden, primarily that Blacks be allowed to elect their own representatives and be in control of their local judicial system. Influenced by proponents of Black nationalism of previous periods, as well as being inspired by the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, many Blacks started to view the oppression of African Americans as part of the larger exploitation of the proletariat worldwide. Because of this, the authors show that what the Black masses needed was not Garvey's racial chauvinism, the Black radicals believed, but world revolution. This attitude would define decades of Black agitators and intellectuals, especially in the later periods of the 1960s and early 1970s, which is characterized by intense confrontation between the so-called revolutionaries and the white establishment. In this earlier period from 1915 to 1954, it was very clear that the white establishment did not want to change. What many people fail to realize, including myself, was that even before the New Left movement of 1950s and onwards, there was intense provocation through organized labor to push the government to enforce mandates that prevented businesses from discriminating against Blacks in their hiring process. The authors point out that it is undoubtable that the identification of areas of unity in the class and race questions that occurred during this era transformed the political landscape for both labor and African American struggles. Due to the Cold War that pitted Western capitalism against Soviet-style communism, a government-sponsored purge began in America after World War II, which rid public and private institutions of not just millions of radicals, but also liberals. For example, many prominent socialists, such as W.E.B. Du Bois and the black actor and activist Paul Robeson, had their passports seized by the State Department. Not only were perceived threats to the capitalist establishment barred from travel, they also could not speak or perform, resulting in a substantial loss in profits. The author relates that by the mid 1950s, the transformative radical current of black political thought and activism had been seriously weakened by McCarthyism. But as events in Montgomery, Alabama in 1955 would show, the black freedom movement would soon experience another renaissance. McCarthyism would slowly decay in the 1950s as blacks would form surprising and newfound alliances with other marginalized groups, starting a whole new era of reform. An analysis of critical black theoretical ideas from 1915 to 1954 must begin with the perception and ramifications of World War I. Many blacks were divided concerning this conflict. The socialists A. Philip Randolph and Hubert H. Harrison criticized the imperialistic character of the war. Du Bois, on the other hand, saw the war as an opportunity for blacks to gain political advantages. The sad reality was that the war did not eliminate either Jim Crow or global colonialism. America was still segregated. Cyril V. Briggs, born in the British Leeward Islands after writing for the Amsterdam News, became the leader of the African Brotherhood, an organization that was critical of the NAACP and Du Bois' concept of the talented 10th. Instead, the ABB relied on the collective consciousness and militancy of the black working class, where at its height boasted 7,000 members. The authors describe how Briggs and other ABB leaders joined the Communist Party and formed the major black constituency of the radical left throughout the 1920s. As described by the authors, Briggs and the ABB provide some critical insights and recommendations for blacks concerning race and labor, much of what is inspired by the Russian Revolution. Briggs' first recommendation is that to gain for Negro labor a higher rate of compensation and to prevent exploitation because of lack of protective organization, we must encourage industrial unionism among our people and at the same time fight to break down the prejudice in the unions, which is stimulated by the employers. He also describes the collective attitude of whites towards the blacks as misinformation, indifference, and levity, some of the attitude of Western Europe towards the Negro. He also talks of bringing the marginalized blacks to the center of discourse for all to consider, whereby, and the Negro as the most suppressed and persecuted minority should use this period of ferment in international affairs to lift his cause out of his national obscurity and force it forward as a prime international issue. Many leaders in the period of the Second Reconstruction, 1954 to 1975, such as most notably Dr. King and Malcolm X, would bring the problem of segregation and the marginalization of African Americans to the forefront of international attention and discourse through their speeches on the global stage. Briggs' initial analysis of the need for solidarity among all workers is crucial to these eventual developments in the future. Moreover, Briggs also directly alluded to the Russian Revolution, which identified the real enemy of not just the proletariat, but even blacks as, when the Russian workers overturned their infamous government in 1917, one of the first acts of the new premier, Lenin, was a proclamation greeting all the oppressed people throughout the world, exhorting them to organize and unite against the common international oppressor, private capitalism. Lastly, Briggs speaks to the visionary and necessary economic equality for there to be between men and women as capable women can fit themselves for any position, equal pay with men for equal work, full pay during the period of pregnancy, and no work for the mother 2 months before and 2 months after confinement. This was a very futuristic perspective. The authors describe Marcus Garvey, born in Jamaica, as the most charismatic leader and organizer of the largest black national movement in history, the Universal Negro Improvement Association, UNIA. He established the UNIA as a self-help organization for black people, creating branches across America, the Caribbean, and Africa, keeping in mind the work of Booker T. Washington. He was constantly undermined by Western authorities, was imprisoned in Atlanta in 1925, and deported from the U.S. 2 years later. The black diaspora continues to be influenced by his ideas concerning black nationalism and Pan-Africanism. In his Declaration of Rights of the Negro People of the World, he has 12 critical insights or complaints followed by 54 declared rights. Of note are point 46, we demand of all men to do unto us that we do unto them in the name of justice, and we cheerfully accord to all men all the rights we claim herein for ourselves. And point 49, we demand that instruction given Negro children in schools includes subject of Negro history to their benefit. Furthermore, Garvey was very critical of leaders taking patronage from their masters rather than advancing the interests of their followers. Nonetheless, Garvey's wife would be critical in not only helping his cause, but in ensuring that his legacy would live on. Amy Euphemia Jacques Garvey, who along with her husband were fierce advocates of women's rights, was a key political leader, archivist, interpreter, and writer. She wrote for the UNI paper The Negro World while also cementing her husband's legacy in the 1963 book Garvey and Garveyism, which revived interest in the UNIA and the Garvey movement. In her short essay aside called Women as Leader, she writes the importance of matriarchal figures as many a man has risen from the depths of poverty and obscurity and made his mark in life because of the advices and counsels of a good mother whose influence guided his footsteps throughout his life. Like Eleanor Roosevelt and Coretta Scott King, Jacques Garvey's writing and speeches allowed for her husband's legacy to influence a whole new generation of leaders and young people, especially the Black diaspora. The Harlem Renaissance, which lasted from the Red Summer of 1919 to the beginning of the Great Depression in the 1930s, represented a break from tradition and a celebration of Black life and culture. As the authors note, the rise of Harlem as a cultural and social center for Black Americans created the context for a new Black intelligentsia. Although there were numerous writers, musicians, and artists who sought to redefine the parameters of Black aesthetics and creativity, one figure who's almost synonymous with the project of Harlem Renaissance to redefine what it means to be Black in America was Langston Hughes. Langston Hughes was not only a great poet, as seen through his honorific label as being called the Shakespeare of Harlem, but he was also providing a fundamental critique of how whites viewed and denigrated the Black working class, while also denying basic civil liberties. This is demonstrated through his use of Black working class vernacular drawn from African American musical traditions, especially blues and jazz. Hughes' journey began at Columbia University, and shortly afterwards he published his first collection of poetry, Worry Blues, in 1926. By World War II, he was regarded as Black America's most popular poet. In one of his essays, The Negro Artist and the Racial Mountain, he speaks to the difficulties faced by African American artists whereby the Negro artist works against an undertow of sharp criticism and misunderstanding from his own group and unintentional bribes from the whites. In another essay, My America, Hughes speaks to how starkly apparent it is that Blacks have been kept as the lowest economic bracket since the Civil War. Seen through statistics are not needed to prove this. Simply look around you on Main Street of any American town or city. Hughes also foreshadows the importance of an age-old problem, which also consumed the future civil rights movement, seeking the right to vote through his analysis that the South opposes the Negro's right to vote, and this right is denied us in most Southern states. Without the vote, a citizen has no means of protecting his constitutional rights. Hughes called this business as usual policy a caste democracy, whereby the law was not only against blacks and the police enforced it, but these circumstances also seemed normal to the average citizen. There were also female poets who contributed to the Harlem Renaissance, such as Alice Moore Dunbar Nelson, born in New Orleans, Louisiana. She married the very prominent poet Paul Laurence Dunbar, and after her husband's death, married the journalist Robert John Nelson. The authors describe how Dunbar Nelson and her husband published the Wilmington Advocate newspaper in the 1920s and were active in Black Republican Party politics. During the Harlem Renaissance, her work received critical attention by a younger generation of African American writers and poets. Another figure involved in the Harlem Renaissance in the 1920s who was not just a poet, but a novelist, lyricist, civil rights leader, diplomat, lawyer, and teacher was James Weldon Johnson, born in Jacksonville, Florida. He was the lyricist of the Negro national anthem Lift Every Voice and Sing, was the author of the tremendously influential novel The Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man, and was a proponent of Booker T. Washington's Tuskegee Machine. The authors describe that after Washington's death, Johnson and other Black moderates shifted towards the reformist policy of Du Bois and the NAACP. As shown by Johnson's position as the first Black National Secretary of the NAACP from 1920 to 1930. In his short essay, Harlem, the Cultural Capital, Johnson describes the necessity of Harlem as an intellectual incubator for Black people as, to my mind, Harlem is more than a Negro community. It is a large-scale laboratory experiment in the race problem. The Harlem Renaissance did not just set the creative and intellectual foundation for a whole new generation of African Americans seeking newfound opportunities in a country that frequently limited employment and degenerated the view of Black people. It was a place where Blacks could truly be themselves through expression and redefine Black excellence. As the Harlem Renaissance movement was reaching its peak, the Great Depression happened in 1929. Blacks were disproportionately affected as nearly half of all African Americans in the labor force were unemployed. The NAACP was slow to respond to the crisis of Black labor and more radical Black perspectives from the Communist Party, as well as trade unions were unions were gaining greater influence in the African American community. A PhD in economics from Columbia University, Abram L. Harris was seen as the quintessential expert on alternative approaches in economics during his era, through his analysis of working class struggles as well as sharing an interest in Marxist thought. He gradually began to distance himself from leftist policies after he received an appointment as a professor at the University of Chicago in 1946. In his essay, The Negro Worker, A Problem of Progressive Labor Action, Harris describes the need for solidarity between whites and blacks through an analysis of their mutual struggle, while also indicating the obstacles to their unity. To Harris, the two great obstacles to labor solidarity are the psychology of craft unionism and the psychology of race prejudice. He also explains that not only conventional unionism has failed to bring blacks and white workers together for combined political and economic action, but also race prejudice defeats their mutual welfare. Harris also speaks for the need for concerted action and courage in labor organizing, because a labor movement which avoids the unpleasant job of going into these industries because the workers have manifested no desire for organization, or because organization will take time and money, is both timid and reactionary and will become the victim of its own inertia. Harris also speaks to the need to develop independent political action whereby a labor party which would connect the Negro special racial demands with its broader economic and social reforms can in time wean large sections of the Negro workers from the major parties. Moreover, here the progressive must show the Negro masses that the problem, like that of the white masses, is inevitably that of work and wages. Unfortunately, Harris also believes that even though the black and white bourgeoisie are detached from the reality of both black and white working class life, most black workers will rely on employment from the controllers of the means of production, the masters of finance and industry. Harris firmly believes that a remedy to unfair working conditions is not just for a working class fellowship to form between people of all races, especially blacks and whites, but also concerted efforts to organize the proletariat once it is united. However, Harris was by far not the only black labor organizer and scholar critical of the economic conditions of blacks and the everyday member of the working class in an era of great change and conflict. So as you see, this era of Black history is a very much characterized by an association of the race exploitation being linked to class exploitation, and due to this fact, many black organizers sway towards a communist perspective of economics, especially during the Great Depression, when it would be seen that capitalist exploitation led to massive unemployment and depression of the economy throughout America and around the world. So I thank you for listening, and I'll be presenting part 2 of that discussion about the Harlem Renaissance, the Great Migration, and the World Wars. Thank you.